The air at the Miller Estate auction tasted of dust and desperation. It was the summer of '76, a time when the price of corn was high and the talk at the co-op was all about expansion. Most farmers were there to hunt for the big, the new, the shiny. They walked past the rows of old iron with barely a glance, their eyes fixed on the dealer-consigned John Deere and International Harvester tractors gleaming under the hot July sun. Their chrome exhaust stacks reflected a sky as blue and full of promise as a banker's smile. I wasn't one of them. My name's Jedediah Stone, and I was farming the same 320 acres my grandfather broke with a team of mules. I was there for one reason, and it was tucked away behind a collapsing hayrick, half swallowed by weeds. It was a versatile 145, one of the early ones, probably a 68 or 69 model. Its red paint was faded to a dull, chalky pink, streaked with years of rust, bleeding from every bolt and seam. The jewels were cracked and weather-checked, the cab glass was spider-webbed on the driver's side, and a family of starlings had made a home in the air cleaner stack. It looked like a forgotten relic, a monument to failure, and that's exactly why I wanted it. "Looking at the junk pile, Jed," a voice boomed behind me. I didn't have to turn around, it was Richard Caldwell. Rich had inherited the farm next to mine, and in 5 short years had leveraged it into an empire of nearly 2,000 acres. He walked with the swagger of a man who shakes hands with his loan officer more than he grips a wrench. He was wearing a brand new seed corn cap, clean jeans and boots that hadn't seen a lick of mud. "Just lookin', Rich," I said, running a hand over the cold, pitted steel of the Versatile's frame. It was solid. The articulation joint looked beefy, no visible cracks in the welds. He laughed, a loud, obnoxious sound that made a few other farmers turn their heads. "What are you going to do with that boat anchor? Tie it to the fence line to keep the land from blowing away?" His 2 buddies, who farmed as much with their mouths as they did with their tractors, chuckled along with him. "Might be some good parts in it," I said, keeping my voice even. I knelt and peered underneath, trying to get a look at the differentials. They were Eaton axles, heavy duty. Good bones. "Parts," Rich scoffed. "Jed, they got a brand new 4630 over there with a soundguard body, air conditioning and a radio. The bank's write-in paper at 7%. You're out here kicking tires on a museum piece. You can't make money living in the past." I stood up and wiped the grease from my hands onto my worn denim pants. "I make enough," I said quietly, "and what I make is mine. That 4630 won't be yours till the bank gets its $30,000 plus interest. This one," I patted the Versatile's massive fender, "this one will be mine the second the auctioneer says sold." Rich just shook his head, a smirk plastered on his face. "Suit yourself, Stone. Some of us are trying to build something. You have fun with your toys." He and his friends sauntered off toward the main auction line, their laughter trailing behind them. I knew what they said about me at the diner. Jed Stone, the man who was scared of progress. The man who still ran a 52 Farmall M for chores and whose main tillage tractor was an International 1066 he'd bought, used and paid for in cash 5 years ago. They saw my cautiousness as a weakness, my refusal to take on debt as a lack of ambition. They didn't understand. My father had nearly lost this farm in the 50s. I still remembered the hushed, worried conversations through the thin farmhouse walls. The look in my father's eyes when the banker's car pulled into the lane. I swore I would never let that happen on my watch. Owning your land was one thing, owning the iron that worked it was the other half of the equation. The auctioneer finally got to the back row. When he called out the Versatile, most of the crowd was already drifting away for lunch. He started the bidding at $1,000. Silence. He dropped it to $500. More silence, broken only by the buzzing of horseflies. "Give me $200, I said, my voice clear and steady. The auctioneer looked at me, then at the tractor, then back at me, a flicker of pity in his eyes. "I got $200. Who'll give me $250? Silence. Rich Caldwell, standing near the food truck, yelled out, "Better check if the scrap man will give you that much, Jed." A fresh wave of laughter rippled through the remaining crowd. My face burned, but I kept my eyes on the auctioneer. "Sold," he finally barked, slamming his gavel down on his block, "for $200 to the man who likes a challenge." It took me the rest of the day to get it home. I had to hire a local trucker with a lowboy, and we spent 2 hours wrestling the dead machine onto the trailer using 2 other tractors and a logging chain. The whole time, I could feel the eyes of my neighbors on me. Driving that wreck down the county road was like a parade of my own stubborn foolishness. When we finally got it into my machine shed, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The place smelled of diesel, grease, and old steel. The smell of my life. My wife, Sarah, came out with a glass of iced tea. She looked at the monstrous, silent tractor, then at me. "Jedediah Stone, what have you done?" she asked, but there was a small smile on her face. She knew me better than anyone. "I bought us a 4-wheel drive," I said, taking a long drink of the tea. It was cold and sweet. "You bought a pile of rust," she corrected gently. "The rust is just on the surface," I told her. "Underneath, there's a Cummins engine and a solid frame. It's all there." That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, I went back out to the shed with a drop light. The air was cool and quiet. I hooked the light under the hood and stared at the heart of the beast, a Cummins 555 V8. They called it the triple nickel. It was caked in a thick layer of oily grime, but it was all there. I put a wrench on the crankshaft bolt and gave it a pull. It was stuck fast. The engine was seized. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Rich Caldwell's mocking laughter echoed in my ears. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had just bought a $200 10-ton boat anchor. Now, before I tell you what I found when I pulled the heads off that triple nickel, I want to ask you something. Have you ever taken a chance on something old and broken, something everyone else had written off as junk, just because you saw a glimmer of what it could be? Maybe it was an old truck, a piece of furniture, or a tool you found at a flea market. Let me know down in the comments what it was, and if you were able to bring it back to life. All right, let's get back to that seized engine. For the next 2 weeks, that Versatile owned me. I started by pulling the injectors and filling the cylinders with a 50-50 mix of acetone and transmission fluid, a concoction my granddad swore by for breaking loose stuck pistons. While that brew worked its magic, I tackled the rest of the machine. I drained every fluid. The hydraulic oil was milky with water contamination, and the differential fluid looked like chocolate pudding. I pulled the drain plug on the engine oil pan, and what came out was a thick black sludge that barely flowed. It was a bad sign. After 3 days of soaking, I put a 4-foot breaker bar on the crankshaft bolt. I pulled until my back screamed and the veins stood out on my neck. Nothing. It was locked up tighter than a banker's fist on a foreclosure notice. There was no way around it. The engine had to come apart. I spent a full day just cleaning the grease and dirt off the engine block so I could get to the bolts. I used a putty knife, wire brushes, and 5 cans of engine degreaser. By the time I was done, I had a pile of greasy dirt on the floor big enough to bury a dog in. The next step was pulling the heads. The cast iron was heavy, and I had to use my engine hoist to lift them off. When I looked down into the cylinders, my heart sank. The number 3 and number 5 cylinders on the right bank were filled with rusty water. The pistons were fused to the cylinder walls with a thick crust of corrosion. The engine hadn't just been sitting, it had been sitting with water in it. Probably from that starling's nest in the uncovered exhaust stack, letting the rain in year after year. This wasn't a simple repair, this was a complete teardown and rebuild. The work was slow and methodical. I labeled every part, every wire, every hose. I took the engine block down to bare metal. The pistons had to be hammered out from below with a block of wood and a sledgehammer. They came out in pieces, leaving behind cylinder walls that were deeply pitted and scored. The block would have to go to the machine shop in town to be bored out, and the crankshaft would need to be turned. Every evening, I'd come into the house smelling of solvent and despair, my hands stained black with grease that wouldn't come out from under my fingernails no matter how hard I scrubbed. Sarah would have a hot meal waiting. She never once said, "I told you so." But I could see the worry in her eyes. The parts were starting to add up. A full engine gasket set, new oversized pistons and rings, new rod and main bearings, a new oil pump. The bill was climbing past $1,000, then $1,500. That was a lot of money in 1976. Meanwhile, the world kept turning. Rich Caldwell would drive past my lane in his new John Deere, the cab lit up at night like a spaceship, pulling a 24-foot disc that covered ground 3 times as fast as my old 14-foot International. One afternoon, he stopped at the end of my lane. I was out by the mailbox, and he leaned out of his air-conditioned cab. "Still playing with your erector set, Jed?" he yelled over the hum of his diesel engine. "Get in there," I said, trying to keep the exhaustion out of my voice. "You know," he said, lowering his voice to a confidential tone, "the PCA man was just out to my place. He said they've got money to burn. Said they'd finance a new Steiger for a fella like you, a man with a good piece of ground. You ought to think about it. This work you're doing, it ain't productive." I just looked at his shiny green tractor, then back at my machine shed where my Versatile sat in 100 pieces. "I'm being productive, Rich. I'm building equity, not debt." He just laughed and shook his head again. "Whatever you say, Jed." He put the tractor in gear and roared off down the road, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. That night, the doubt hit me hard. I sat on a 5-gallon bucket in the shed, staring at the disassembled engine. The sheer number of parts was overwhelming. What if I couldn't get it back together right? What if, after all this work and all this money, it still wouldn't run? I thought about that new Steiger. I thought about the ease of just signing a piece of paper and having a new, reliable machine delivered the next day. The temptation was a physical ache. It would be so easy. But then I thought about my father. I thought about the weight of a loan, the constant nagging pressure of a payment that comes due whether the rain falls or not, whether the price of corn is up or down. I looked at my hands, calloused and stained, and I saw his hands. I got up, picked up a wrench, and went back to work. It took another month, but I finally got the engine back from the machine shop, the block clean and freshly bored, the crank polished and gleaming. The reassembly was like a sacred ritual. I checked the torque on every bolt 3 times. I used plastigage to check the bearing clearances, making sure everything was within 1/1000th of an inch of spec. I set the timing, adjusted the valves, and finally, after 6 weeks of relentless work, the engine was back in the tractor's frame. The day I was ready to start it, I felt like an expectant father. I'd replaced every hose, flushed the fuel tank, rebuilt the starter, and installed 2 new heavy-duty batteries. I checked the oil, filled the radiator with fresh coolant, and bled the fuel lines up to the injector pump. I climbed into the cab. The seat was torn, the gauges were faded. I turned the key. The starter groaned, turning the big V8 over slowly, 1 revolution, 2. It felt like an eternity. Then a puff of white smoke coughed from the newly installed exhaust stack. I kept the starter engaged. The engine turned faster, and another puff of smoke, darker this time, shot out. And then it happened. With a deep, guttural roar, the Cummins V8 fired to life. It wasn't a smooth, quiet hum like Rich's new Deere. It was a loud, angry, mechanical symphony. The whole tractor trembled, the shed vibrated, and thick black smoke poured from the stack before settling into a steady, hazy rhythm. I sat there for a full minute, my hand on the throttle, feeling the raw power thrumming through the steel beneath me. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I had taken a pile of junk and breathed life back into it. It was mine, every last bolt. The next few years were the good years. The late 70s were a boom time for American agriculture. The Russians were buying our grain, prices were strong, and land values were shooting up so fast it made you dizzy. The talk everywhere was of expansion, of getting bigger. The banks were practically giving money away, using the inflated land values as collateral. It was a gold rush, and Rich Caldwell was leading the charge. He bought the 80 acres to the north of me, then the quarter section to the west. He built massive new grain bins and a state-of-the-art machine shed that looked more like an airplane hangar. His new John Deere 4630 was soon traded in for a massive, articulated 8640, a 4-wheel drive beast with 8 huge tires and a price tag that could have bought my entire farm twice over. He bought a new combine, new planters, new trucks. He was farming close to 3,000 acres now, all of it on borrowed money. At the co-op, he was treated like a king. Farmers would listen intently as he held court, talking about his marketing strategies and his trips to the commodities exchange in Chicago. He'd clap me on the back and say, "Jed, you're missing the boat. You've got to get in while the getting's good." Meanwhile, I stayed put on my 320 acres. My old Versatile, which I'd painted a fresh coat of factory red, had become my primary tillage tractor. That triple nickel Cummins pulled my 21-foot chisel plow through our heavy clay soil with a deep, throaty rumble that you could feel in your chest. It wasn't fancy, the cab had no air conditioning, and on a hot day with the sun beating down, it was like working in an oven. The radio I installed could barely be heard over the engine's roar. But it never broke down. It just ran, day in and day out. It was simple, easy to work on, and every drop of fuel it burned was turning soil that I owned, with a tractor that I owned. The good prices meant I had extra money for the first time in my life. But instead of buying more land or new equipment, I paid off my small operating note at the bank. I put a new steel roof on the barn. I tiled the 40-acre field down by the creek that had always been too wet. And the rest I put away. I opened a savings account and a few certificates of deposit. In a time of rampant inflation, putting money in the bank seemed like a fool's game to most people. "You're losing money every day that cash sits there, Jed," Rich told me one day at the parts store. "Inflation's at 12%. You need to put that money to work. Buy land. Land is the one thing they're not making any more of." "I like the feeling of cash in the bank," I told him. "It sleeps better at night than a loan does." He just shook his head, the way he always did. To him, and to most everyone else, I was a failure. I was the man who had a chance to get rich and was too scared to take it. They saw my discipline as fear, my self-reliance as a lack of vision. They couldn't see the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. But I could. I started hearing whispers. The news on the radio in the evenings wasn't all good anymore. They were talking about an oil crisis, about lines at the gas pumps in the cities. They were talking about a man named Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, who was promising to break the back of inflation no matter the cost. One afternoon in the fall of '79, I was at the bank in town depositing a check from the elevator. The bank president, Mr. Harrison, was in a tense conversation with Rich Caldwell. Rich was laughing, but it sounded forced. "Now, Frank," Rich said, "don't you worry about a thing. The price of land went up another 10% this year. My balance sheet is solid as a rock." "The prime rate went to 15% this morning, Richard," Mr. Harrison said, his voice low and tight. "The note on your 8640 is variable. Your payment is going to nearly double." "It's temporary," Rich blustered, waving a dismissive hand. "A little bump in the road. You gotta have faith in the American farmer, Frank." As I walked past, I heard Mr. Harrison mutter, "It's not faith I'm worried about, Richard. It's the math." I stepped out of the cool, air-conditioned bank and into the bright autumn sunlight. A cold wind was blowing from the northwest, rattling the leaves on the big maple trees in the town square. It felt like the first real wind of winter. I looked down the street and saw my old Ford pickup, paid for. I thought of my machine shed, filled with iron that was mine, free and clear. I thought of that rebuilt Cummins engine in the Versatile, sitting quiet and waiting for spring. A deep, unsettling feeling settled in my gut. The boom times were over. A reckoning was coming. And for men like Rich Caldwell, who had built their empires on the shifting sands of cheap credit, the ground was about to give way. The year 1980 began not with a celebration, but with a slammed door. President Carter was on the television, his face grim, announcing a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. Just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The price of corn at the local elevator, which had been flirting with $3 a bushel, dropped 50 cents overnight. By spring planting, it was struggling to stay above $2.50. It was the first tremor. At the co-op, the confident talk of expansion was replaced by nervous muttering. The men who had been bragging about the new land they'd bought were now quietly recalculating their cash flow projections on the back of greasy napkins. Rich Caldwell was the loudest voice, trying to keep the optimism alive. "It's a temporary political move," he'd declare a little too forcefully. "Prices will bounce back by harvest. They have to." But his eyes, which had always held a confident gleam, now had a frantic, hunted look. The interest rates were the second tremor, and it was a big one. Paul Volcker's war on inflation was relentless. The prime rate, which had seemed outrageous at 15%, began a steady, terrifying climb. 16, 18. Before the summer was over, it would top 20%. Every farmer with a variable rate loan, which was nearly everyone who had expanded, felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach with every tick upwards. Their operating notes, the money they borrowed each spring for seed and fertilizer, were suddenly costing them a fortune. The payments on their new machinery were becoming monstrous. I felt it too, of course. The low price of corn hurt my bottom line just like everyone else's. But the difference was, I had no payments. The fuel for my Versatile cost the same as the fuel for Rich's John Deere, but my tractor wasn't also costing me $2,000 a month in interest. My savings account, which Rich had called dead money, was now my lifeline. It was the buffer that allowed me to buy my inputs without borrowing a dime from the bank. That spring, the cracks in Rich Caldwell's empire began to show. I saw it first in the little things. He was a meticulous farmer, but now a few of his corn planter units were leaving skips in the long rows. He was running too fast, trying to cover too many acres with too little time. Then one day in early June, I saw his prized John Deere 8640 sitting silent in the middle of a field, a dark stain of hydraulic oil spreading on the tilled earth beneath its belly. 2 days later, the dealer's service truck was in his yard, a sight no farmer ever wants to see. I ran into one of the mechanics at the parts store a week later. "Heard you were out at Caldwell's," I said, keeping my voice casual as I paid for a new set of fuel filters. The mechanic, a young man named Dave, sighed and wiped his greasy hands on a rag. "Yeah, quad-range transmission is shot. He must have been pulling that 40-foot field cultivator in too high a gear, trying to save time. Cooked the clutch packs. It's a full teardown. We had to split the tractor in two right there in his shed." "That's a big job," I said, shaking my head in sympathy. "Big bill, too," Dave said, lowering his voice. "Gonna be north of $12,000 by the time we're done. And we can't get the parts. They're on back order for 3 weeks. He's dead in the water right when he needs to be cultivating and side-dressing nitrogen." For the next 3 weeks, Rich's biggest, most expensive tractor sat idle while the weeds grew in his corn and soybean fields. He tried to keep up with his older, smaller equipment, but he was too far behind. He had built a system that depended on everything working perfectly, on maximum efficiency and maximum speed. The moment one critical piece failed, the entire fragile structure began to wobble. The real trouble started that fall. The harvest was decent, but the prices were abysmal. The elevator was paying just over $2 a bushel for corn. At that price, after deducting the sky-high cost of fuel, seed, and fertilizer, all inflated by the same economic forces crushing the grain markets, there was nothing left. For men carrying heavy debt, it was a catastrophe. They were losing money on every acre they farmed. I saw Mr. Harrison, the bank president, drive into Rich's lane one afternoon in October. He wasn't in his usual Lincoln Town car. He was in a plain Ford sedan, and he didn't get out of the car with a smile and a handshake. He sat in the lane for a long time, and I could see him and Rich talking through the open window of Rich's pickup. The conversation looked heated. When the banker's car finally pulled away, Rich didn't get out of his truck. He just sat there, his head bowed over the steering wheel as the sun set over his fields of golden corn, a harvest that was no longer a symbol of wealth, but of ruin. That winter, the silence in the countryside was heavy and cold. There was no talk of buying new equipment. The only talk was of who was going to survive. The farm crisis had arrived, and it was going to be a brutal, unforgiving winter. My old Versatile sat in the shed, its simple, rugged frame a silent testament to a different path. It didn't gleam or boast of modern comforts, but it was paid for. And in the winter of 1981, that was the only thing that mattered. By 1982, the countryside felt like a war zone. The landscape was littered with the casualties. White auction bills, stark as tombstones, were nailed to fence posts along the county roads. Every week, it seemed, another neighbor was selling out. These weren't retirement auctions. They were foreclosure sales, liquidation events where a family's entire life, their land, their home, their machinery, their history, was sold off to the highest bidder under the cold, indifferent eye of a banker. The mood at the diner turned from nervous to funereal. Men who had been proud and independent now spoke in hushed, desperate tones. They talked about deficiency judgments, about Chapter 11 bankruptcy, about the impossible math of 21% interest on an operating loan when corn was $2 a bushel. Land that had been appraised at $3,000 an acre just a few years before was now lucky to bring $1,000, if you could even find a buyer. The banks, which had pushed the loans so aggressively, were now trapped. They had collateral on their books that was worth less than half of what they had loaned against it. They became ruthless. Rich Caldwell fought as hard as he could. He sold off a quarter section of his newest ground at a staggering loss just to make his interest payments. He sold his new grain truck and his wife's car. He started working on his own equipment, something I hadn't seen him do in years. I'd see the lights on in his big machine shed late into the night. His confident swagger was gone, replaced by the stooped shoulders of a man carrying an impossible weight. The brand new seed corn caps were replaced by old sweat-stained hats pulled down low. We didn't talk much during that time. The gulf between our fortunes was too wide, too awkward. Once I saw him at the co-op, trying to get a load of fertilizer on credit. The manager, a man who had once treated Rich like royalty, was shaking his head apologetically. "I can't, Rich," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The bank has a lien on your entire crop. I can't extend you any more credit until they sign off on it." Rich just stared at him, his face pale. He turned without a word and walked out, his boots scuffing on the concrete floor. He looked right past me, but his eyes were vacant, seeing nothing. In that moment, he wasn't my rival anymore. He was just another farmer caught in the gears of a merciless economic machine. My own situation was tight but stable. I farmed my 320 acres. I planted my seed, which I paid for with cash from my savings. I cultivated my corn with my old Farmall M. I did my heavy tillage with the Versatile. My machinery was old, but it ran. And when something broke, I could fix it myself with parts from the local store, not with a $12,000 visit from the dealer. My wife Sarah planted a huge garden, and we canned enough vegetables to last us through the winter. We didn't have much, but what we had was ours. We were surviving. The end for Rich came in the fall of '83. The foreclosure notice was printed in the legal section of the county newspaper. The auction was set for a cold Saturday in early November. It was for everything: 2,800 acres of land, the house, the bins, the state-of-the-art machine shed, and a line of equipment that was the envy of the county just a few years prior. The day of the auction was grey and bleak, with a raw wind that cut through your coat. The crowd was huge, but it was a somber gathering. It wasn't like the Miller auction where I had bought my Versatile. There was no festive atmosphere, no laughter. Farmers stood in small, quiet groups, their hands shoved in their pockets, their faces grim. They were there to witness a tragedy, and they all knew that with a little different luck, it could have been any one of them. Rich was there, standing near the back of the crowd with his wife and 2 young sons. He looked like a ghost. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He was watching his entire world, his father's legacy and his own ambitious dreams, being dismantled piece by piece. The auctioneer started with the small items, then moved to the machinery. The big John Deere 8640, the symbol of Rich's empire, was last. It had been washed and polished, but it couldn't hide the wear and tear of a tractor that had been run too hard and maintained with desperation. The bidding was sluggish. In 1978, that tractor had a sticker price of nearly $70,000. The bidding stalled at $22,000. The banker, a hard-faced man I didn't recognize, was standing next to the auctioneer, chewing on an unlit cigar. He gave a curt nod. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his voice echoing in the cold air. The sound was like a hammer blow. I watched Rich flinch. His wife put an arm around him, and he leaned into her, a broken man. I had come to the auction with a purpose. I had spent the last 2 years saving every penny I could. My savings account, which had once seemed small, now felt like a fortune in a world where cash was king. When the auctioneer moved on to the land, I was ready. They sold it off in parcels. Most of it went to out-of-state insurance companies and investment groups, buying it up for pennies on the dollar. Finally, they got to the last parcel, the original 160 acres that Rich's grandfather had homesteaded. It included the house, the old barn, and the first machine shed he had built. It was the heart of the farm. It was his home. The bidding opened at $700 an acre. I let the investors and the big operators fight it out for a minute. When the bidding slowed at $900, I raised my hand. $9.50, I said, my voice steady. A few heads turned. The man from the insurance company looked at me, then at his notes, and gave a slight shake of his head. The numbers didn't work for him anymore. I have $9.50, the auctioneer called out. Do I hear 1,000? Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling around the corner of the barn. Sold, he shouted, pointing his gavel at me, for $950 an acre to Jedediah Stone. A murmur went through the crowd. I walked to the clerk's trailer, my legs feeling strangely weak, and wrote out a check that drained nearly my entire life savings. I didn't buy a bargain. I bought a piece of history. I bought a neighbor's home. The next morning was a Sunday. I walked across the corn stubble that separated our farms and knocked on Rich Caldwell's back door. He answered, looking surprised to see me. His eyes were red-rimmed. "Rich," I said, getting straight to the point, "I bought your home place yesterday." He stared at me, his expression unreadable. I could see a flicker of the old anger, the old rivalry, but it was quickly swamped by exhaustion and defeat. "Come to gloat, Jed? Come to tell me you told me so?" "No," I said quietly. "I'm not here to gloat. I'm here to make you a proposal. I'm going to rent the land back to you, for a share of the crop. A fair share, and you and your family can stay in the house, rent-free for the first year, until you get back on your feet." He just stood there, speechless. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His wife had come to stand behind him, and I could see tears welling up in her eyes. "Why?" he finally choked out, "after all the times I rode you, all the things I said." I looked past him, at the old barn his grandfather had built, its paint peeling, but its frame still true. I thought about my own father, about the fear I'd felt as a boy when the banker came to call. "Because this is your home, Rich," I said, "and in this part of the country, that's supposed to mean something. We're neighbors." He finally broke. The pride that had driven him to build an empire and then to ruin crumbled away. He slumped against the doorframe and covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. His wife stepped forward and put her hand on my arm. "Thank you, Jed," she whispered. "God bless you." I just nodded and walked back across the field to my own home, the cold November air feeling a little less bitter than it had before. The years that followed were lean, but they were healing years. Rich and I became partners, in a way. He farmed my new 160 acres, along with a few other small parcels he managed to rent. He used his old, smaller equipment, the things he'd managed to buy back from the auction for pennies on the dollar. We worked together, helping each other during planting and harvest. The old rivalry was gone, replaced by a quiet, hard-won respect. The community changed too. The farmers who survived the crisis were a different breed. They were more cautious, more resourceful. The talk at the co-op was no longer about leverage and expansion. It was about soil conservation, managing input costs, and fixing your own machinery. Men started coming to my shed, asking for advice on how to rebuild a transmission or fabricate a part they could no longer afford to buy new. My old Versatile, once a symbol of my stubbornness, was now seen as a symbol of wisdom. It was the tractor that had weathered the storm. I never got any bigger. My 320 acres, plus the 160 I rented to Rich, was enough. We lived comfortably. We put our 2 children through college without taking on a single loan. Rich eventually got back on his feet. 10 years after the auction, he came to me with a check from the bank. He'd secured a modest loan, and he bought his home place back from me for exactly what I had paid for it. The handshake we shared that day was one between equals, between survivors. Now I'm an old man. My son Daniel farms this land. He's a good farmer, smart and hard-working. He uses modern equipment, GPS, and computer models that I can barely understand. But the lessons of the 80s were etched into him. He buys used equipment whenever he can, and he pays cash. He knows how to weld, how to turn a wrench, and how to read a balance sheet with a skeptical eye. Sometimes, on a quiet summer evening, I walk out to the old machine shed. The Versatile 145 still sits in the back corner. Its red paint is faded again, and there's a fine layer of dust on its broad hood. It doesn't get used much anymore, just for odd jobs. But every now and then, Daniel will climb into the cab and fire up that old triple nickel Cummins. The engine still erupts with that same deep, throaty roar, a sound that shakes the very foundations of the shed. He does it, he says, to remember. I run my hand over the cool, pitted steel of the fender, the same spot I touched all those years ago at the Miller auction. Rich Caldwell was right about one thing that day. I couldn't make money living in the past, but it turns out you can build a future on it. You can build a life on the simple, solid principles of owning what you have, caring for what you own, and knowing the difference between what you want and what you truly need. That old tractor wasn't just a pile of rust. It was the best $200 I ever spent. It was the anchor that held me fast when the winds of fortune turned into a hurricane, a storm that washed away empires and left only the foundation standing. And our foundation, built on solid ground and paid for steel, was strong enough to hold. It was strong enough to last.